Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jack, Santosh, for coming. I'm Jorge Arteiro, Cloud Developer Advocate from Microsoft. We have Jack, Program Manager for the Application Gateway for Containers. Welcome, Jack.
Yeah,
And have
thanks
Azure
for having
MVP,
me on.
Santosh. Sorry, Jack.
Thanks,
Second.
Jack. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, let's. Jack is going to kind of deep dive in Azure Application Gateway for Containers. Just came like GA a couple of weeks ago. And that's the time where the customer is looking to move to production. And let's see what we have, what kind of use case you can have to go to production with Azure Application Gateway. Welcome, Jack. And if you want to share your screen, I know that you like to show the Azure portal and go straight for it and hands-on presentations. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. All right, perfect. So thank you again for having me on the session. We're really excited to be able to connect with the community, and we're really excited to also finally announce general availability of App Gateway for Containers. So for those that haven't used App Gateway for Containers or heard about it, I'll take like 5-10 minutes just to kind of go through what it is, why we introduced this. For those that have used Application Gateway, which is our layer 7 or application load balancer for Azure, quite some time back, we introduced an add-on called our Ingress Controller. And basically, it was a controller that you deploy inside of your cluster. It keeps track of your ingress configuration in Kubernetes, and then it translates that configuration to Azure Resource Manager calls on App Gateway. And so this has worked well in time, but as customers have continued to push the limits of what Azure can offers, we're now looking at Application Gateway for Containers as the next successor solution to AGIC, or as the next step in the journey. And so when you look at App Gateway for Containers, the underlying design looks very similar to, I'll say, AGIC or App Gateway Ingress Controller, except for what we've done is we've now introduced this massively scaled control plane. And what that does is it allows us to almost feel like App Gateway for Containers is deployed inside the cluster without it being deployed into the cluster. And customers might go, well, why not deploy it into the cluster? So there's some definite benefit to having it outside of the cluster. One, you aren't using cluster resources, so you can save all of your compute for your workloads. And two, with this kind of sitting outside the cluster as part of Azure's infrastructure, it just feels native to the platform. You get the native integrated monitoring, you get the native like platform support, whether that's service health or Azure Diagnostics. These are all kind of familiar concepts with Azure. So it's part of Azure's ecosystem natively. But again, kind of going back to, well, why this? Why not just have AGIC v2? So as I said, as customers continue to push the bar and have even larger and larger and larger scale, there are some challenges with having so many control plane calls. And so with App Gateway for Containers, we introduced this new massively scaled control plane to process those requests as quickly as possible. Our goal is to have it almost feel like it's real time. We don't want any delay. The second you make a change in ingress, it should just be reflected immediately. And another really big kind of benefit to App Gateway for Containers is we now introduce the kind of, I don't know if I can say the successor to Ingress, but Gateway API is now generally available. That was announced at the last KubeCon in November, and we have full support for that. So those that have been watching Gateway API, it was in alpha, then beta. Now it's generally available as version 1. So with the GA of AGC, we adopt Gateway API version 1 as well. So there are some huge quality of life updates in using Gateway API. The fun thing, at least when I was going through documenting, was to be able to compare and contrast, you know, how you do something in Ingress API versus how you do something in Gateway API. And as part of general availability, one of the last things that we introduced right at time of GA was like redirect support. And as you read through the documents on how you do redirects in Ingress, you can see that you have to define a whole bunch of Ingress resources. You have what we call our Ingress extension, which eliminates the need of 100 annotations. In Gateway API, that's much more simplified, only down into a couple resources. And then there's some additional capabilities that were challenging in AGIC as well. When you start to look at roles and responsibilities inside of the cluster, how do I give team A access to only a subset of the configuration versus team B? And how do I make sure that if team A introduces a config change that's incorrect, it doesn't prevent team B from being able to modify their configuration and have that converge? And so not only have we improved the performance, improved the scale of AGC, we have been listening, and a lot of the requests from a feature perspective have been implemented into AGC as well.
That's great, Jack. I think I love that performance, improvement, and now have milliseconds updates on the route. And Gateway API is something that I recorded before with the team, and is something that you could explain a little bit more. I see the difference that before we have different annotations for each one of the the suppliers, let's say Nginx and other one, different ingress controllers used to have like very specific annotations. And that was a nightmare when we want to move from one ingress to another one. And I can see now with Gateway API, we are avoiding that. It means that the same resource definition we can use across different, let's say, products, including Application Gateway. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to not have to have implementation-specific details. This is even inside the docs here. This particular page is only a subset of the annotations that we had for Ingress. I think there's like close to 30 of them in Ingress API, and that's all implementation specific. And so if I can use what's provided out of the box by Gateway API, one, just because it's familiar, and two, to simplify my life, the quality of life in using and defining some of these rules, that's a huge advantage in agility, right? I don't have to go out and learn something new, something very specific. So if you're coming from another solution, this should feel just like at home for you. We really took the approach, maybe I'll take a step back. When Application Gateway was introduced, and I've mentioned this in a couple of my other talks as well, Application Gateway was like one of the very first services on Azure. And Azure was a completely different world, a decade ago. Even the concept of Azure Resource Manager wasn't even a thing when I started at Microsoft. And so Azure has really evolved. Well, Kubernetes is a huge evolution as well, especially when you start to talk about infrastructure. And so when App Gateway came about, it was really geared towards infrastructure. And now when you look at App Gateway for containers, we're taking that next step and we're like, how do we make a great solution for Kubernetes? And we started with the Kubernetes experience, and we're building kind of first centric on that experience versus the other way around. And so I think, a lot of the challenges and a lot of the kind of tricky of, how does this work, or why is it done this way? A lot of those questions aren't going to be applicable when you look at App Gateway for containers. And the thing I should have started out with as well, it's a little bit weird. Application Gateway is in the name of this particular product, but it's part of Azure's application load balancing family, or a layer 7 load balancer family. And so we wanted it to feel, feel familiar for those that have invested in Azure and in our application load balancing portfolio. And so we kept the application branding, or the Application Gateway branding. But this is essentially net new. We started from scratch. We built it based on that Kubernetes experience.
Sounds great. Santosh, any question for Jack so far?
No, thanks for the introduction, Jack. It was really great. Even I used in AGIC earlier, and as you mentioned, there are some limitations which has been quite. I mean, in the production, I think AGC has been looking great. Can you expand about the features like URL redirect and availability zone landings for all this resiliency factors?
Yeah, in terms of resiliency, there's a couple of improvements for this particular solution. The first thing is when you deploy App Gateway for containers, we always require it to be zone redundant if the region supports it. In App Gateway, you could choose which zone that you do prefer. However, in this case, we essentially force zone resiliency on the service so that you have the highest resiliency in the region. In addition, App Gateway in the past also allowed you to kind of set manual scaling and things of that nature. And what we found is customers can, sometimes oversize the gateway or undersize the gateway. That can present some challenges. And so out of the box, we configure auto scaling by default. So as you put load on the solution, it should scale out and hopefully be at the exact level of scale that you're looking for. The third thing is the ALB controller. Without the ALB controller, that's the missing link between the Kubernetes world and the Azure world, right? In App Gateway Ingress Controller, we unfortunately had one pod of the controller running. And so if that particular node went down that had that pod, your load balancing configuration would essentially not happen until that pod gets spun up on another node. And so in App Gateway for containers, we've made that node highly available. It's on at least 2 nodes. So if one node goes down, that secondary node can pick up and continue updating that configuration.
Good. Thanks for that. Let's really appreciate that. Auto scaling is a great feature because customer no need to worry about the scaling factor, and it can go on manual error as well. Correct.
That sounds good, Jack. I think you're going to show us the different ways that you can deploy Application Gateway for containers.
Yeah, so in the documentation, when you start out with AGC, you have this decision to make, which is what strategy do you want to follow to deploy the solution? And the thing I want to really stress is following one strategy over the other one is not like strategy 1 is better than strategy 2. It's just different ways that you can deploy App Gateway for containers that matches how the organization kind of provisions things today. And so we thought about 2 different personas, and that introduced 2 different deployment strategies. The first scenario is what we call the bring your own deployment strategy. And what this means is, let's say that I have an infrastructure team that maintains a lot of the Azure resources. And then in Kubernetes, I reference that infrastructure that's already been provisioned to me as a developer. For those scenarios, you would want to follow the bring your own deployment model where you can allow the infrastructure team to go ahead and create AGC, join it to the right networks, and then inside of Gateway API or Ingress API, reference those resources that have been pre-created in Azure. Or maybe you're deploying through a CI/CD pipeline for all Azure resources, and again, you want to reference that within Kubernetes, then the bring your own deployment strategy is for you. The second option is managed by ALB controller. And this means your lifecycle is solely owned inside of Kubernetes. If I want to define App Gateway for containers, I create a new custom resource called an application load balancer, and that will create the AGC resources for me. As I want frontend, which is what a client will connect to, I define a gateway or an ingress resource. And then as I want all my listeners, contoso.com, fabricam.com, whatever it may be, I define that inside my HTTP routes or again inside the listener or inside the ingress resource. So to kind of summarize that, the deployment strategy, the question that's coming to you is, where do you want the life cycle to start for these resources? Do you want it to start in Kubernetes and end in Kubernetes? Or do you want it to start in Azure and end in Azure?
Yeah, sounds interesting. And also, you probably have to give some permission for the AKS cluster to create those resources. And then maybe that will be the decision if you can give or not the AKS cluster permissions for the managed identity to create those resources. Is that the case, Jack? What kind of permission they needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you're looking at our documentation, we try to design it in a way where you can kind of follow it from start to finish and have something that's working outside of it. And so the reason why I mentioned that is if you're setting up AGC, the first thing that you're going to do is deploy the controller, right? That's the piece that's running inside the cluster, taking a look at the ingress and gateway resources and translating that back up to Azure. And so as you're provisioning this, it will talk about the identities that you need to use to be able to allow that controller to reach out to Azure. If you're doing a bring your own deployment, then you don't need to create the AGC resource. You don't need to create, a virtual network, a subnet, etc. Right? It's always going to be referenced. If you do want the controller to manage the lifecycle and create those resources, then you will need to delegate the permissions for that identity accordingly. So we do have those documented inside of inside this list here.
Yeah, that's great. That makes sense. And it's all about how you're going to manage your operation team, how they work. But they pretty much, Application Gateway for Container is going to work the same way. There's no change on the way that the product works. It's just who is deploying the Application Gateway for Container itself. It's from the cluster, from the operation teams running like Terraform or any other kind of bicep automation there.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not one way is better than the other way. It just really depends on how the organization operates. Some really large organizations, they have teams that are dedicated for infrastructure, for you have your networking team, your security team, your dev team, etc. Right? Obviously, you're going to operate a little bit differently than if you're a smaller organization. Maybe there's 5 developers that are all together and we're wearing many different hats, right? So in that case, yeah, managed scenario is probably the easiest. I'm already in Kubernetes, let it just handle it for me. So it really depends on how your organization works. No pro or con, it just whatever your preference is. We want options, right?
Yeah, Santosh, you probably can say something like, for the big customers, you're normally going to say, do like using automation first, create the resource.
Yep, that's correct. As Jack mentioned, right? Because many of my customers have their own dedicated team, like platform team manages the Kubernetes and infrastructure team and network team is separate actually. So I had another question for Jack. Jack, is there a specific requirement for the networking stuff? Is there some dedicated subnet or any kind of an allocation is required as part of the deployment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So look for actually going to be in this scenario here. Perfect, it's right in my face. So when you deploy App Gateway for containers, actually, maybe I should go back one step here. There are 3 different resources that make up this particular offering, right? I have this thing called Application Gateway for Containers, which is what we call our control plane. It's what's listening for the configuration that's coming from the controller running inside of my cluster. The second resource that's introduced as part of this service is what we call a front end. And a front end is just a way for exposing an endpoint that clients can connect to. A common misconception is that a front end means a domain name or a host name, like contoso.com. That is not true. That is not what we intended the front end to be. The front end is supposed to be, again, that unique endpoint. I don't want to say it's a unique IP address. We give a unique front end or a unique FQDN, very similar to Azure Front Door, that you can map your domain names to, right? Contoso.com, Fabricam.com, CNAME record or A record it, or however you want to do it, DNS record it, to our front end, away you go.
Yeah.
And again, the reason why you have those front ends is it maps back into the Kubernetes world as a gateway resource or as an ingress resource. And that allows me to have full roles and responsibilities separate, but still using the same infrastructure investment. So that's why we have the concept of a front end. And then the third resource is an association. And the association is what deploys what we call our data plane. It creates the data plane and connects it to your virtual network, specifically a subnet that you define. Once that association is created, that's what allows us to be able to proxy this traffic to your Kubernetes cluster. And so you have those three resources that always make up the entire AGC solution.
Okay, so that subnet is...
Oh, go ahead.
No, the subnet is dedicated for AGC, right? That's a delegation we have to provide.
Yep. Regarding the subnet requirements, you will define subnet delegation for the App Gateway for Containers service. So nothing else will have control into that network. You're telling Azure, hey, reserve this for the AGC service. And then secondly, we do require a /24 subnet size. So that is about 250 IPs. A lot of customers might go, holy cow, why do you have so many IPs, etc. The reason why is we're just future-proofing the deployment. If you started at scale of, small and then you went to really large, that's really future-proofing your environment to allow that gateway to naturally expand out. So I know for some customers that are limited on IP space, that may be more challenging, but /24 is required today.
I understand that that's where the auto scaling feature comes in to help us if the loading is going or not.
Yep. Now, if
Thanks.
let's say that you did have two completely different AGC deployments. You wanted different front ends, you wanted different associations, like everything should be totally separate. Maybe you have prod AGC and then you have dev AGC and you want the entire data path to be separate so that you can do perf testing, not affect production and so forth. In those cases, you certainly could have your association point to the same subnet. In that case, right, instead of a /24, maybe you have a /23, which will give you the 500 addresses that you would need. So if you want to put more than one AGC deployment into the same subnet, that's totally fine. But you do require that full address space per AGC deployment.
Understood.
That sounds good. Let's see that. Do you have a demo for AGIC or anything else you want to show before the demo?
Yeah, we can do a demo. Let's see here. Let's jump over to this window here. Hopefully this isn't too small. We can zoom in if needed. So yeah, AGC is a little bit weird from the standpoint that everything is done in Kubernetes. There's really no UI in the Azure portal. In fact, maybe I should show that really quick because I'm really visual. If you look at the App Gateway for Containers resource, the only thing that you're going to see is the AGC resource, front ends, and association.
If you can zoom in a little bit, only just to make sure that that's fine. Yep. That's fine.
Okay, perfect. So like I said, the concept of listeners, the concept of rules, all of the items that you're familiar with in App Gateway, that's really all now inside of Kubernetes. So as we define our ingress resources or we define our gateway resources, all of those rules, listeners, etc., are all going to be defined inside of Kubernetes. So cool. So maybe like the first demo, let's take a look at a couple of different resources. So the first command I'm going to run here is just to get a list of gateway resources. So on this particular cluster, I have two different gateways. Remember, a gateway has cardinality to a front end. And so for this particular example, if I jump back to the Azure portal here and look at front ends, you can see I have a couple of front ends here. The reason why I have three is Gateway 01 and Gateway 02 that you saw in the previous command, those created a front end for me as kind of the managed scenario. This third front end that I had created this in Azure. And if I want to reference this on one of those gateways, I can. But the two gateways that we created are technically linked to these front ends. And again, the gateway itself, if you're not familiar with Gateway API, it's just defining what front end you're listening on, and then it's defining which set of ports you're listening on. So if we take a look at Gateway 01, on this particular gateway, you can see I'm listening on port 80, so HTTP traffic, and then I'm listening on port 443, and I have a certificate defined or a secret defined to do TLS. And so kind of the first thing, if we do get secret, this secret right here is essentially my TLS certificate or my SSL certificate for the front end of the gateway itself. One thing that has come up in our feedback is, hey, can you integrate with Azure Key Vault? Today, we pull those certificate references solely from Kubernetes, which you could basically reference Key Vault at that point, kind of a two-step process. We are looking at direct integration into Key Vault longer term, but as it is today, your secrets are referenced inside of Kubernetes, and then from there, you can reference Key Vault or however you're getting the cert in there. So cool. Now the next thing that we'll do is let's send traffic to this thing. So what I need to do is, like I said, a gateway has cardinality to a front end. And if we look at the gateway, inside of the status of the resource, it will tell you which host name that traffic should be received on, right? So if I look at AGB, I can see AGB here as my front end. That's kind of the association that's going on there. Now, I'm going to send traffic to contoso.com. Since I don't own contoso.com, we have to do a little bit of magic here to get curl. Ooh. Let me switch to this here. I have to do a little bit of magic here to get curl to use the IP address of that front end, right? So if I look at this, that's essentially the front end IP that's going on there. So if I send HTTPS traffic there, it loads perfect. If I do verbose, you can see the TLS certificate info and so forth. So you know for a fact, hey, that's great, we're listening on HTTPS. So not super exciting demo, but if I was doing TLS offloading or SSL offloading, this is essentially the way that you do it. You define, let me jump back here. You define the certificate on your gateway. And then again, for those that are not familiar with Gateway API, you have what's called an HTTP route. And the HTTP route is where your listeners are defined, your routing rules are defined, and so forth. Specifically, when that traffic was received by the gateway, it was hitting this HTTPS Contoso HTTP route. We look at the config here. You can see it's sending the traffic to the backend on port 80. Now, if you wanted to do end-to-end SSL, totally supported. In this case, your port would probably be 443 or whatever port your backend pod is listening on. And then you define, basically just define that it's going to go over HTTPS or SSL. Cool. So then kind of the next scenario, this was more of a recent add, is redirect support, right? If I want to ensure that client requests to contoso.com are sent, I want them to always be on HTTPS. In the preview, we didn't have support for this until we went GA. And so if you sent it on port 80, it was kind of unfortunate. You'd have to modify your app to send them over to the other location. And so in this particular case, we look at my second route here. You can see we have a filter. And again, this is new to Gateway API. I shouldn't say it's new to Gateway API, but it's part of Gateway API, not something that was in Ingress. And we can just say, hey, I want to do an HTTPS on the protocol. I want it to be a 301 redirect. If I want to do 302, I can put that in there. And we want it to match basically any request. So /* is what's going to send you over to HTTPS. And so if I use my same curl command here, let me jump over to this machine. You can see I'm now listening, or I'm sending the request to port 80. And AGC is returning back that 301 redirect. So I don't have to have a backend pod that's listening on, or I don't have to have a rule for port 80 and then have a backend pod that's just doing redirects. I can just have AGC handle the redirects before it even gets to my cluster, which is really nice. So any questions so far?
No, I think I had a question. I think you answered it doing your demo. I was just asking about the end-to-end TLS. I think you said it's feasible. That's great.
Yep, that's fully supported. In fact, we can go one step further. For the backend, I don't have a demo of this, but it is in our documentation. We jump back over to this window here. If we look at how-to guides, Gateway API, here you can follow the guide on doing mutual authentication to the backend. And this is something that we didn't have in AGIC or in Application Gateway. This is like a net new layer 7 feature for AGC. So for those pods that do require mutual authentication, that is now fully supported. We do that through a custom resource called backend TLS policy. So for those that are familiar with Gateway API, especially like during the preview days of Gateway API, mutual authentication was a little bit non-fully defined. And so we had used backend TLS policy, and I believe that's what they use now. I'd have to double check. But inside of there, you define all of your certificate properties to establish that connection.
That's great.
Yeah, I think the only comment for me is make sure that you follow the documentation. If you do not use to the Gateway API and the YAML files that you need to to do those configurations that Jack was showing on his terminal, and you can see here on the documentation as well. And looks like there's a lot of different use cases. Like
Yeah,
SSL offloading, I can see SSL offloading there.
One thing I should add is you'll notice that there are more features in Gateway API than there are in Ingress API. Our strategy right now is to make what was available in AGIC, which was all Ingress, available in AGC and Ingress as well. However, you will see some of the new future capabilities only become available in Gateway API. Gateway API is kind of the long-term direction that we're placing bets on. And so we did try to, as much as possible, document those same use cases. So you can compare AGIC's implementation of Ingress to AGC's implementation of Ingress and kind of translate accordingly. However, I would say if you do have the chance to treat AGC as greenfield environment, highly recommend you use Gateway API to set yourself up for long-term success. Even in some cases where you're moving from AGIC's Ingress implementation to AGC, again, if you can, use Gateway API. You're making some of those translations manually today on your own. And so if you're spending the time, it's worth your time in doing it in Gateway API. And not to derail, but that kind of opens up, hey, Microsoft, what's the strategy on migration from AGIC to AGC? So we know that there's a gap in the documentation today. Soon we'll update the docs to bring this guidance, but essentially the guidance right now is it is fully supported to run AGIC's controller and AGC's controller in the same cluster. And so what you can do is you can have AGIC running, serving up traffic, go ahead, deploy App Gateway for containers, Then go ahead and define your ingress or your gateway deployment, validate everything looks good to go. And then at that point, you would do a DNS record swap and start sending traffic to that AGC front end. Once everything is totally good to go, then at that point, you would deprecate or remove AGIC at that point. So it is a little bit manual. We are looking at options for automating that. We do kind of want to make a simple or easy button to help with the migration, but as it is today, run them in parallel, allow yourself time to do the validations that you need to do to have the confidence, and then go ahead and make that transition. That should be no downtime at that point, right? So they're both running in parallel, same cluster. It will give you some flexibility in migration.
That sounds good. And you can see it on the Gateway API documentation there. You have more use cases, like you said. Some use cases like traffic splitting and things that only available with Gateway API. That's not something simple that you can do with Ingress. Depends of what Ingress we are using, and they need a lot of annotations, and here you can just do with the new Gateway API definition. That sounds good.
Yep. So kind of talking about traffic splitting, that is one more demo if you're curious, or if you want me to run through it quick.
Yeah, let's go. Let's do it.
All right. So let's jump back to our console here. So in this, wrong console. So let's take a look at our HTTP routes again. So another example that I have is this traffic split route. This is almost verbatim from our documentation. So if you're following along in the docs, you can set this up in your environment. If we take a look at the HTTP route itself, you'll see that the backend reference is to this application that we call backend v1 and v2. Again, that's out in the documentation if you want to deploy that. And we've set a weight on each of these items. So basically, backend v2 is going to be preferred over backend v1. Like 1 out of every technically 6 if you add this up would go to backend v1, and then the rest will go to backend v2. Now, it's not going to be like 100% where it's like always 1 and then it's 5, right? You're always playing odds of all traffic that's hitting the front end. So if it's not like 100% accurate, like I get it, but statistically, you should see the weighting of that traffic happen. If you don't define the weights, then by default, AGC is going to use round robin. So if you just want, hit backend 1, backend 2, backend 3, that's the behavior that you get out of the box. So we don't really need to do anything too crazy here. If I jump back, you had seen I just created this domain name. Again, this is all local. I'm kind of spoofing IPs and things like that to make this happen. But weighted round robin is the request that I'll send this to. And all this does is that application spits out this JSON response. And in that JSON response, you'll see the pod that's serving this traffic. And so if I look at before this call here, I created just a really quick script. And all it does is every second it calls out there. And it looks at the pod that's surfacing this up. So if I do weighted round robin here, you can start to see I have all the traffic kind of hitting this one pod. And then here we got a couple of requests that went to the second one more often than the first one. So you can see it's definitely preferring traffic to backend v2 versus backend v1. Again, it's not exact like 1 versus 6. It depends on what's going on at the time. There's other requests that are hitting that front end, but statistically, you're going to get very close to that 1-to-6 ratio. So yeah, that's kind of the demo. It's, again, these are some fairly basic concepts, but weighted traffic distribution isn't something that we had in AGIC, and like we know it's been requested for quite some time. So we're really excited to be able to start adding the check marks to what the community's been asking us for quite some time.
It's amazing to see these, like done so easily now with just like a simple resource definition there. And then you can have those features that we normally only have on, fully packaged products like container apps or, app service, things like that. And now you can have on AKS, managing yourself the way that you want. That's very nice.
Yep. The other thing too, this is kind of taking things down another tangent here. Before the call, I set up another kind of demo application. All this does is it spits out the headers of the requests that you sent. So one thing I did want to bubble up, it's very similar to AGIC. For those that have different like logs configured and you're looking for very specific items, we try to keep them almost identical in AGC as well. So when a request comes in and gets sent to your pod, we do etch into every request a couple of headers. You'll always see the original IP address and the X forwarded for. And then similarly, we added this X request ID. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is this helps tremendously with debugging. You'll see this ID not only in the request to the backend pod, but if we take a look at diagnostic settings, AGC looks almost identical to App Gateway. You have the concept of access logs. And access logs is what contains all the information about the client requests that are coming into your gateway. So if I back up here, I suppose I could use log analytics, but I'll do it this way here too. If I look at, like in this particular case, I have the logs being sent out to a storage account. So we'll kind of dig into the storage account here. Log analytics, great way to do it as well. You can use KQL to just query the requests. And we do have some built-in queries too, which is like, hey, give me the 4xx responses, or give me the 5xx responses. Those are already pre-built as pre-built queries, which is nice. So let me go ahead and open this up. So inside this access log, like I said, if you're familiar with App Gateway, or if you're familiar with Azure Front Door, this is almost the exact same format. When I sent that request, you can see the host name that was sent. You can see which front end it arrived on, which port, what the user agent was, what the specific URL is.
A little bit.
Hitting it, yeah. Let's see. Plus, there we go.
Yep, there you go.
So this will give you all of that information that you're looking for. And the same with that request ID. You'll see that as tracking ID. This is a way to kind of correlate end-to-end debugging with all the requests that are coming into your gateway. So again, from a familiarity standpoint, if you've used Azure Front Door or App Gateway, we try to keep this as similar as possible.
That sounds good.
Sounds good, yeah.
Cool.
I think Jack reads my mind. I was about to ask you about diagnostic settings, and you've just been on top of that, actually. Thanks for it.
Yeah, no problem. The other thing too, I've shown this in a couple of other sessions as well. If you look at metrics, we do have some metrics that are published in there as well. The one that I like to show is HTTP response status. Like how many requests are being sent to the front end. At face value, this isn't super useful, right? Like, that's great, there's 31,000 requests. What does that mean to me? The thing I always stress is don't overlook filters and splitting. If I take a look at splitting, this will show me my response code. So now I can have a really quick alert that says, trigger an alert if I'm getting 5xx responses. Typically, that means my backend app is down, and to a customer, their request isn't going to look right? But we can also then take that one step further, and you can filter that down by specific front end. I don't remember which front end I was using, but now I've got it down to at least the specific front end, which means I know which gateway resource to go take a look at, or which ingress resource to go take a look at. So we have added some additional telemetry inside of metrics that's new from what AGIC used to bubble up as well, especially on the backend side of the house. If you look at like backend HTTP response, and we look at backend service, let's see if this is going to be populated. Oh shoot, this one doesn't have it. The thing that's nice is we'll bubble up the actual service that we're sending requests to. And so that will be able to help you really figure out like, okay, I know at least service XYZ is the one that's triggering all those 5XX responses from the backend.
That's great. You have one more demo for us, or?
Yeah, I have. We can do one more demo. So, as I kind of had mentioned earlier, one of the big things that we've really stressed with AGC is making sure that we can keep up with the scale, with what customers are doing with inside of their Kubernetes cluster. And so, oh boy, let's see if I can make my screen look a little bit nicer here. Okay.
This is about the real time. This is about the real time scenario update back into the AGC.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So similar to, shoot, before I made this really tiny, I should have done this. So very similar to what we did with the weighted round robin scenario, and I've shown this in the public preview sessions as well that I've done. Basically, we're sending a response every 0.1 seconds to contoso.com, and it's showing which pod is surfacing that traffic. So if I do this front end loop, you can see all the traffic is going to essentially the same pod. And the reason why is my replica count is just 1 for that. And so with the new control plane, like I said, we really want it to feel like AGC is running inside the cluster. We don't want any lag time between the two. And so I'll paste 2 commands in here. The first one is to increase the replica count, and the second command will show you the pods being created. And so it won't be immediate, and the reason why it's not immediate is I'm creating new pods, but at the same time, once those pods are ready, you should see AGC like immediately start sending traffic to those. So I know 10 pods isn't super massive, but it doesn't matter if it's 10 pods, 1,000 pods, 5,000 pods, all of those variations are supported. So that pasted really weird, but you can see it's going ahead and creating, those are running, and now I immediately am load balancing those pods. So it's like almost instant from the time that that pod is up and running, we try to load balance that traffic right away.
Yeah, that's great. And not just like creating, like if Kubernetes has to move your pods to another node or something, that will be also done quickly. And that was the main, I think, issue before the previous versions of Application Gateway was how long it takes to, if one node fails and have to move your pods around, and how long it was taking to redirect the traffic to the new pod.
Yep. So we're really excited that the control plane, we like all the investments that we've made in there. In every video, I always try to give a shout out to our devs. Without them, none of this would have been possible. As a PM, like I feel a little bit guilty because I'm kind of the face, but I really want to give sincere appreciation to our devs because they've spent a ton of time to make this possible. I mean, this is a tremendous improvement for those that have used AGIC. Again, this is our next step in the journey, so we're really, really excited to share it with everyone.
It is, and now we are GA means that you have support, everyone can go to production. And yeah, if you want to go now, discuss a little bit, what's coming, roadmap, or if not, I would say leave your comments here. That will be, the AKS comment channel that will be this video. Make sure that you subscribe and, have notifications on to get, all the news from the AKS community. That's a new channel from the Azure Kubernetes Service team. And
Yeah, so roadmap. So I can give a little bit of insight into where we're going, but I can't kind of disclose everything here. So one item that we know customers are asking about is web application firewall support. Web application firewall support has not been forgotten on App Gateway for Containers. It's actively in development, and that's something that we will be releasing very soon. We wanted to make sure that the core functionality of the product is solid. We have a very solid foundation to build upon, and you'll start to see many more scenarios light up this calendar year. So WAF coming soon. It'll be introduced in the form of WAF policy. So if you're familiar with Azure Front Door or App Gateway, when you define your custom rules, if you want to do rate limiting, all of that is kind of built in. So you'll have that same experience out of the box. Another common question is overlay support. What's going on there? So I can confirm overlay support will come to AGC. There's definitely some challenges around having AGC communicate with overlay, right? The network itself is within the cluster. So if you're deployed outside of the cluster, how do you actually communicate with it? So there's a great collaboration going on internally within Microsoft across a couple different teams to make that happen. We have not forgotten about it. That will also be coming out relatively soon as well. I know soon is a hard word to consume because it could mean like 5 years from now, or it could mean tomorrow. But you'll see both WAF and overlay support light up this year. I know like this year sounds really long, but we're closer to it than we are further away. So those are the two big features. Unfortunately, some of the other items that we do have planned, I can't talk about too awful much quite yet. But I will say, like, we have a really exciting roadmap ahead for this calendar year. So please, like, stay tuned on service updates. If you're not familiar with Azure service updates, you can subscribe as an RSS feed and get product updates, like not even AGC, but just across Azure as a whole. And then the other thing I also want to bubble up. In our documentation, if you look at Kubernetes references, or references, I should say, you'll see ALB controller release notes. This is where we track each version of ALB controller. And so as we release the next version of the controller, as we release new capabilities to AGC, you can use this to kind of keep up to date, very specific to AGC. So definitely one item you might want to bookmark, because this will always keep you up to date on what the absolute latest and greatest is of the controller.
That sounds great, Santosh. I don't know if you have any questions for you. Not because roadmap. I think if people have any question, then leave a comment here. I'm pretty sure that if there is any customer that really wants some feature that's not there yet, but keep in mind that GA now, what's in there, we are supporting, and but the product team is always open. I'm sure, Jack, to discuss with customers that want to use some feature, and that's even in preview.
Yeah, the other thing too that I've also kind of pointed out in a couple of other videos or sessions that I've done is if you look at feedback.azure.com, you can go ahead and share different ideas of what you want to see come to App Gateway for Containers. This isn't a black hole. A lot of customers think like we don't look at it like, hey, this was open 3 months ago and so forth. That's definitely not true. We do take a look at this to kind of help us prioritize what is coming down the pipeline. The one thing I would say is, and I should have actually prefaced this at the beginning, App Gateway Ingress Controller is not deprecated right now. That is one thing that I do want to stress. Like, don't worry if you do have AGIC in production. That's fully supported. If you open up a support case, you're still supported. We released GA 2 weeks ago. it will take time to bring feature parity to all AGIC scenarios. Like one scenario is mutual auth to front end. We know that that's one gap, right? And so as we continue to build that feature parity, then we'll consider taking that next step. But I do want to stress that you are fully supported if you are using AGIC. There are some scenarios that we know need to come to AGC, so have a little bit of patience, but we're really focused on, let's solve for the platform. Let's make sure that the platform is solid. Let's make sure that we have the feature parity with AGIC. And then at that point, we can really start to cruise forward on some new capabilities as well.
That's really great. And I like the idea to not have those ingress controllers running on the cluster or using, like external product where you only have to care about scaling your application inside the cluster. And all the routing will be the only thing will be like the AOB controller, but everything else will be running outside. Then you don't have to care about scaling the ingress controller or anything. You only care about scaling your application.
Yeah, or there's an O-day and something. You don't have to worry about going and patching the project that you're built upon. All of this is maintained by the platform. Those are things, at least like as a developer, I don't really care about that kind of stuff. So if it can just work, that's what we're going for.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for your time. It is a great thing. As you mentioned, right, the Application Gateway platform, the family has a lot of features. As you mentioned, just GA for 2 weeks now. You can just wait for some more time to get all the features back into this for the containers of AGC. Great.
Yep.
Yeah, and if you are a customer that start using that in production, let us know as well. You want to know, and if you want to record it for us or create a use case to show for other customers, we appreciate your support as well. Thank you, Jack. Thanks, Santosh.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm sure if you look for Jack Stromberg, I'm like I shouldn't say I'm the only Jack Stromberg on LinkedIn, but you'll probably see me with the AGC announcement out there. So if you have feedback or questions, feel free to send me a message as well. That's one thing that we also really want to bring is being more involved in the community. Please reach out. Let us know what we're doing right. Let us know what we're not doing right. That helps us make sure that the product is as best as it can be.
Yeah, that sounds good. Follow Santosh, our Azure MVP, both here in Melbourne, Santosh as well, and Jack is in US. And keep updated and let us know. Thank you for watching.
Thank
you, everyone.